The sun was a hammer and the anvil was the land. For 43 years Silas Ward had felt its unforgiving strike, a rhythm that had shaped him as surely as the wind had carved the canyons. It had beaten the softness from his face, leaving a topography of squint lines and sun-cured leather. It had pounded the easy laughter from his voice, leaving a gravelly quiet that settled in the corners of his lonely ranch house like dust. His solitude was a fortress built of loss, its highest tower a memory 15 years tall, a monument to a brother named Marcus. The grief was no longer a raw wound but a permanent part of his landscape, a dead tree on a ridge he had to look at every single day. He lived with it. He farmed around it. The sound came first, a discordant note in the symphony of wind and insect chatter, the groan of an ungreased axle, the tired plod of hooves. Silas looked up from the fence post he was mending, his hand resting on the worn hickory of his hammer. A wagon was crawling toward his property line, a dark slug against the bleached gold of the plains. It was an unusual sight. Visitors were rare, sellers of goods, rarer still. He squinted, his perception a finely honed tool. The man driving the wagon was hunched, a nervous energy radiating from him even at this distance. But it was the cargo that snagged at something deep inside Silas, an old wire suddenly plucked. 3 horses, their heads obscured by heavy burlap sacks. He straightened, the hammer now hanging loosely in his grip. There were reasons to hood a horse, to calm a wild one for transport, to protect its eyes from injury. But this felt different. The sacks were tied with a crude finality, a deliberate concealment that felt less like husbandry and more like a secret being kept. The wagon rattled closer, kicking up a plume of ochre dust that hung in the still air like a held breath. Silas didn't move. He let the man come to him, his stillness a form of currency in this land where any sudden movement could be a threat. The wagon lurched to a stop a dozen yards away. The driver, a gaunt man with a twitchy Adam's apple and eyes that darted like spooked minnows, offered a weak, ingratiating smile. "Afternoon," he rasped, his voice thin as straw. "Name's Boone Carter. Just passing through. Got some fine horseflesh for sale, if you're in the market." Silas's gaze remained on the 3 hooded shapes. They stood unnaturally still, their silence a heavy counterpoint to Carter's nervous chatter. Why the sacks? Silas's voice was flat, devoid of invitation. Carter's smile flickered. "Ah, well, they're skittish. From a wild herd up north, the hoods keep 'em calm on the road. Less trouble for everyone." He licked his lips, a quick reptilian motion. Prime stock, though. Strong, healthy. Be perfect for a man with a spread like this. Silas walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the parched earth. The scent of stale sweat, cheap whiskey and fear rolled off Boone Carter in waves. But beneath it was another smell, cleaner and more vital, the scent of horse. He stopped beside the wagon, running a hand along the rough-hewn sideboard. He could feel the vibration of the animals through the wood, a low thrum of life. Something about their stillness, their patient endurance under the suffocating burlap, pulled at him. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a haunting familiarity, a whisper from a locked room in his memory. He couldn't place it. The feeling was a phantom limb, an ache for something he didn't know was missing. "Let me see them," he said. Panic flared in Carter's eyes. "Now hold on. They get real agitated without the hoods. Best to do the deal first. I'm offering a fair price. A real bargain, seeing as I'm in a hurry to get to Blackstone before sundown." Silas's eyes narrowed. The lie was as plain as the scar on Carter's cheek. Every detail, every word screamed of desperation. This wasn't a sale, it was a disposal. The horses were a liability. "No man buys a horse he can't look in the eye," Silas stated, the words an old piece of wisdom from a voice he hadn't heard in 15 years. Marcus. The name echoed in his skull, sharp and painful. Marcus, who could read a horse's soul in its gaze. Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple doing a frantic dance. I can't. The boss, he said. He cut himself off, his face paling. "The boss?" Silas's voice dropped, the quiet turning dangerous. "You're not your own man, Carter?" The drifter flinched, cornered. "Look, mister, it's just a job. I move the horses. You want 'em or not? $50 for all three. That's practically giving 'em away." $50. It was an insult. 3 healthy horses were worth 10 times that, at least. The price wasn't a bargain, it was proof of a crime. Stolen, then. That was the obvious answer. And yet the feeling nagging at Silas wasn't about stolen property. It was deeper, more personal. It was the insistent ghost of that long-dead familiarity. He glanced toward the horizon, a habit born of years of watching for storms, for trouble, for anything to break the crushing monotony. The sky was vast and empty. He was a man who trusted his gut. It had kept him alive when sense and reason had failed. And right now, his gut was screaming at him, a silent, urgent alarm. The sacks, the price, Carter's fear, it was all a shell game designed to distract from what was right in front of him. He looked from Carter's shifty eyes back to the hooded horses. The one in the middle, a tall chestnut, shifted its weight, and for a fleeting second its posture, the proud arch of its neck even under the suffocating cloth, was so achingly familiar it stole his breath. "I'll take them," Silas heard himself say, the decision forming before the thought was complete. The words felt heavy, fateful. Relief washed over Boone Carter's face so intensely he nearly sagged against the wagon wheel. "Good. A smart choice, mister. A smart choice." He scrambled to unhitch the lead ropes from his wagon, his hands shaking. Silas went into the house, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The inside was sparse, clean, and lonely. A stone fireplace, a simple table, a single chair. He took the money from a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the sum of months of hard labor. He counted it out, the worn bills feeling flimsy and inadequate for the weight of the transaction he felt he was making. When he returned, Carter had already tied the horse's leads to the fence post Silas had been mending. The man snatched the money from Silas's hand, not even bothering to count it. "Pleasure doing business," Carter mumbled, clambering back onto his wagon. He cracked his whip, and the wagon lurched away, rattling into the distance with a desperate urgency, leaving Silas alone with his purchase. The silence descended again, thicker now, charged with anticipation. The 3 horses stood as before, their hooded heads bowed slightly, as if in mourning. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The air grew cooler. Silas stood there for a long time, just watching them, the strange sense of premonition growing stronger, colder. He felt like a man standing before a row of coffins, knowing he had to open them but fearing what he would find inside. The burlap sacks were no longer just cloth. They were shrouds, hiding a truth he felt was his own, a truth that had been deliberately, violently buried. He untied the lead ropes from the fence and led the horses toward the main corral beside the barn. They followed without resistance, their steps soft and sure-footed. Another flicker of familiarity that made the hair on his arms stand up. He slid the heavy wooden bolt on the gate, ushering them inside, the space where Marcus's own horses had once kicked and snorted and filled the air with life. The corral had been empty for 15 years. He approached the first horse, a dark bay mare. Her ears twitched beneath the sack, sensing his presence. He reached up, his calloused fingers finding the rough knot of the rope beneath her jaw. The fibers were coarse against his skin. He hesitated. The feeling was overwhelming now, a sense of standing on a precipice. With a deep breath that did little to calm the tremor in his hands, he pulled the knot loose. The rope fell away, and he slowly, deliberately lifted the burlap sack. The mare blinked in the fading light, her large, dark eyes soft and intelligent. She was beautiful, a fine animal, but she was a stranger. He felt a pang of disappointment, a foolish deflation of the tension that had been building in him all afternoon. He moved to the second horse, a powerful black gelding. Again, he removed the hood. A strong, handsome animal, with a small white star on his forehead. Nothing. Just a horse. The tension in Silas's gut began to curdle into self-reproach. He had let a shifty drifter and his own loneliness spin him a fantasy. He had paid $50 for 3 stolen horses, and a feeling. Then he turned to the last one, the tall chestnut in the middle. The one whose posture had first snagged his soul. The light was failing fast, the world sinking into the soft gray of dusk. The horse stood perfectly still as Silas's hands went to the rope. This time, his fingers fumbled. The knot was tighter. He worked at it, the coarse rope scraping his knuckles. Finally, it gave way. He took hold of the bottom of the sack with both hands. He lifted it off, and the world stopped. The horse's left eye was a deep, familiar brown. The right eye was a startling pale blue, a sky-blue marble set in a field of chestnut. Above that blue eye was a thin, white scar, a sliver of moon against the dark hair. And on its forehead, branded not by a hot iron but by nature itself, was a perfect white marking in the shape of a crescent moon. Silas's breath hitched in his throat. His knees went weak. The hammer he'd forgotten he was still holding slipped from his numb fingers and fell to the dust with a dull thud. Zeke, he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips, a prayer he hadn't uttered in a decade and a half. The horse's ears swiveled toward the sound. He blinked his mismatched eyes, then took a hesitant step forward and nudged Silas's chest with his muzzle, a soft, searching pressure that bridged 15 years in a single instant. The gesture was a key, unlocking a torrent of memory so powerful it brought Silas to his knees. The smell of sawdust and hay, the sound of his brother's laughter. Marcus, standing in this very corral, ruffling the forelock of his prized colt. Look, Si. Mismatched eyes like he's got a piece of the sky in his head. And that Mark, we'll call him Zeke, means God will strengthen. He's special. Silas wrapped his arms around the horse's powerful neck, burying his face in the coarse mane that smelled of dust and sweat and time. A sob tore from his chest, a dry, ragged sound wrenched from a place he thought had turned to stone. It wasn't just Zeke. He looked at the other 2 horses, his vision blurring with tears. The bay mare, Belle, the black gelding, Thunder, Marcus's horses, the horses that had supposedly burned to death in the barn fire that had killed his brother. The official story, delivered by the solemn, newly elected Sheriff Tom Rollins, had been an accident. A lantern knocked over in the hayloft, a tragic, senseless event. Silas had been away, working a cattle drive, and had returned to a smoking ruin and a fresh grave. He had accepted the story because the grief was too vast to allow for anything else. It had hollowed him out, leaving no room for questions. But here, now, was the living proof. 3 ghosts made of flesh and blood. They hadn't died in the fire. They had been stolen. And if the horses had been stolen, then the fire wasn't an accident. And if the fire wasn't an accident, a new feeling began to rise through the crashing waves of grief. It was cold, sharp, and utterly clear. It pushed the sorrow aside, tempering it into something harder, something lethal. Rage, a pure, clean rage that burned away 15 years of passive mourning and left behind a singular, unshakable purpose. His brother had been murdered. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the dust of the corral, the warmth of his brother's horse a solid anchor in a world that had just been torn from its foundations. The sun bled out completely, and the stars emerged, cold and distant in the black sky. The past was no longer a memory. It was here, breathing in his arms, its heart beating a steady, patient rhythm against his own. And it demanded a reckoning. The sound of a single horse approaching at a steady clip pulled him from his reverie. He stood up slowly, every muscle tense. He was exposed, vulnerable. He scanned the darkness, his hand instinctively going to the empty space on his hip where a gun should be. The rider came into the weak moonlight, a silhouette that was both slight and solid. The horse was a tough-looking Mustang, and the rider sat it with an easy, practiced grace. As the figure drew closer, pulling up just outside the corral fence, Silas could make out the details. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle holstered in a saddle scabbard, and a face that was as familiar and as changed as the horses in the pen. Her face was leaner, etched with lines of hardship that hadn't been there when she was a girl of 18 with eyes full of hope and a future that included his brother. The softness was gone, replaced by a resilience that was almost startling. But the eyes, when she finally looked at him, were the same. The same intelligent green, though now they held a guarded fire instead of a gentle warmth. "Mercy," Silas breathed, the name feeling strange in his mouth. Mercy Whitmore, Marcus's fiancée. She dismounted in a single fluid motion, her boots making no sound in the soft dust. She didn't offer a greeting. Her gaze was fixed on the 3 horses standing behind him. Her face, already a mask of hardened control, seemed to shatter for a brief moment, a flicker of disbelief, of pain, of a grief as profound as his own. "Seek," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. She gripped the top rail of the fence, her knuckles white. "Thunder, Bell, it's really them." Silas could only nod, his throat tight. Mercy looked from the horses to him, and in her eyes, he saw the same cold fire that was now burning in his own gut. There was no need for questions, no need for explanations of how or why. The presence of the horses told the entire story. She had known, or she had suspected. For 15 years she had carried the same unspoken truth. "I've been tracking them, Silas," she said, her voice low and intense, the sound of steel being sharpened. "Not these 3, not specifically, but horses like them, horses that disappear after fires, after accidents. Horses sold by nervous men like Boone Carter for a fraction of their worth." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "For 15 years I've been following the trail. It's a long one, and it's soaked in blood. But it always leads back to one man." Silas waited, the name already forming in his mind, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place with a dreadful, sickening certainty. The man who had delivered the news. The man who had clasped his shoulder with false sympathy. The man who had built a career on the foundation of his brother's grave. Mercy's voice was a blade in the darkness. "The man who killed Marcus. The man who runs the whole operation. The man who pronounced it an accident." She let the silence hang for a beat, letting the full weight of the accusation land. "Sheriff Tom Rollins." The name hung in the cold night air between them, no longer a symbol of law and order, but a declaration of war. Silas looked at the hardened woman before him, the ghost of the girl his brother had loved. He looked at the 3 horses, living proof of a 15-year-old murder, and he felt the last of his old life fall away, burned to ash by the righteous fire of his newfound purpose. His ranch was no longer a refuge of solitude. It was a front line, and the battle for his brother's memory had just begun. The dawn broke gray and tense, the light seeping over the plains like a spreading stain. Silas and Mercy had spent the night in a state of suspended animation, moving between the house and the corral, their conversation a low, grim tapestry, woven from 15 years of separate threads. Mercy's story was one of quiet, obsessive fury. After Marcus's death, her grief had curdled into suspicion. Rollins' quick, clean closure of the case felt too neat. She had left town not in defeat, but on a hunt. She'd learned to track, to read signs, to live on the trail. She followed whispers of horse theft rings, noticing a pattern, a fire, a grieving family, a few prime horses vanished, presumed dead. It was a ghost trail, full of dead ends and frightened people. Her breakthrough had come a year ago, in a dusty town 200 miles south. She'd found a widow, a woman whose husband, Jake Morrison, had been one of Rollins's first deputies. Jake, consumed by guilt and drink, had died in a bar fight. But he'd left something behind, a small, leather-bound journal. "She gave it to me," Mercy said, her voice flat, as she sat across from Silas at his simple wooden table. The journal lay between them, its cover worn smooth with handling. She was afraid. Jake had told her to burn it if anything happened to him, but she couldn't. She said the truth needed a voice. The journal was the key. It was Jake Morrison's confession and indictment, a detailed log of the operation. The names, the dates, the locations of the accidents. It described how Rollins, then a deputy with ambition, had perfected his method. He'd target a rancher with superior stock, create a distraction, a fire, a stampede, and in the chaos, his men would steal the best animals. Rollins, the heroic lawman, would then investigate, pronounce it a tragedy, and consolidate his power and reputation. Marcus had been one of his earliest victims. According to the journal, Marcus had recognized one of Rollins's men during the theft. He hadn't fought back to save the horses. He'd fought back because he knew them. That decision had cost him his life. Rollins himself had shot him, then set the fire to cover the murder. Reading it, Silas felt the cold rage in his veins turn to ice. Every word was a nail in his brother's coffin, a coffin Rollins had built. Mercy had been waiting, gathering more proof, looking for the one piece of evidence that was irrefutable. She'd been tracking Boone Carter for a week, knowing he was one of Rollins's low-level runners. She had followed him here, never imagining he would be leading her to the very heart of her quest. "He'll come for them," Silas said, his gaze distant, fixed on the corral through the small window. Zeke stood sentinel, his mismatched eyes seeming to watch the horizon. He can't let them live. They're the one thing that connects him directly to Marcus. "He doesn't know we have the journal," Mercy countered, her hand resting on the leather-bound book. "That's our advantage. He thinks it's just our word against his. He'll come to intimidate, to threaten. He'll expect us to be scared." "He'll be disappointed," Silas said grimly. The sound they were waiting for came near midday, the rhythmic beat of multiple horses moving at a confident, deliberate pace, not the frantic scuttling of a Boone Carter, but the arrogant arrival of men who believed the land belonged to them. Silas stepped out onto the porch, Mercy a step behind him, her hand resting near the butt of the pistol tucked into her waistband. Her rifle was just inside the door. Silas's own shotgun, cleaned and loaded, was propped against the wall. 5 riders crested the low rise to the east. The sun glinted off a silver star on the chest of the man in the lead. Sheriff Tom Rollins rode as if he were on parade, his back straight, his chin high. He had aged well, the years adding a distinguished silver to his temples and a weighty authority to his presence. He was handsome, respected, a pillar of the community built on a foundation of bones and lies. The 4 men with him were his deputies, hard-faced and armed, their eyes cold and empty. They were not peacekeepers, they were enforcers. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, forming a semicircle, a clear line of intimidation. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence. "Silas," Rollins said, his voice a smooth baritone, rich with false bonhomie. "It's been a long time. I heard you had some visitors. Thought I'd ride out, make sure everything's all right." His gaze flickered past Silas to Mercy, a flash of annoyance crossing his features. "Miss Whitmore, I'd heard you'd moved on." "The past has a way of calling you back, Sheriff," Mercy said, her voice steady and clear. Rollins's smile was a thin, predatory curve. He ignored her, his attention fixed on Silas. "I got a report this morning. A drifter named Boone Carter was found dead on the Blackstone Trail. Robbed, it looks like. Poor soul." He let the news hang in the air, a warning. The loose end has been tied. "Funny thing is, some folks in town saw him yesterday, said he was hauling 3 horses, hooded. Word is he sold them to you." "Word travels fast," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Rollins' eyes, a pale, cold blue, swept toward the corral. He saw the 3 horses, their markings clear in the bright sun. For a split second, a flicker of something, shock, fury, broke through his placid mask. He recognized them. His gaze snapped back to Silas, the manufactured charm gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. "Those are my horses, Silas," Rollins said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. "They were stolen from a property I administer over in the next county. Carter must have snatched them. I'm here to reclaim them." The lie was so audacious, so complete, it was almost impressive. He wasn't just denying the truth, he was rewriting it in broad daylight. "They're not your horses, Tom," Silas said, the use of the first name a deliberate stripping away of the sheriff's authority. "They were my brothers, and you know it." The air crackled. The deputies shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their guns. Rollins' face hardened, the last vestiges of civility flaking away like old paint. "You're making a terrible mistake," Rollins said, his voice laced with menace. "You're grieving, you're confused. This woman," he gestured dismissively at Mercy, "has filled your head with poison. Marcus died in an accident. It was a tragedy. Let it lie." "There's no lie left," Mercy cut in, her eyes boring into him. "There's only the truth, and it's standing right there in that corral." Rollins's gaze was pure ice. He had come here expecting to deal with a broken-down recluse. He had not expected Mercy Whitmore, and he had not expected this level of defiance. He had underestimated them. It was a mistake he now intended to correct with force. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried with terrifying clarity in the silence. "Here is what's going to happen. You are going to open that corral gate. My men will take the horses. You and the lady will forget you ever saw them. You will go back to your lonely life, and she will ride away and never come back. You will do this because you are smart, and you want to live to see another sunset." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "The alternative," he continued, his voice hardening, "is that you resist, and then another tragedy will happen at this ranch. A fire, perhaps, or a shootout with horse thieves. I'm the law. My story is the one people will believe. I will pronounce your deaths an accident, just like I did your brother's, and I will ride away with my horses." This was it. The moment of irreversible choice. The ultimatum, delivered with the full weight of corrupt power. Surrender the truth and live as ghosts, or fight for it and risk becoming them. Silas looked from Rollins's smug, confident face to Mercy's. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a reflection of his own unyielding resolve. He looked back at the corral, at Zeke, who was watching the confrontation with an unnerving intelligence. The horse was a living link to his murdered brother, a symbol of a bond that violence could not break. To surrender him would be to let Marcus die a second time. Slowly, deliberately, Silas shook his head. "You're not taking them, Tom." The words were quiet, but they echoed across the ranch yard like a gunshot. The deputies tensed, their knuckles white on their reins. Rollins's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. The pretense was over. "Then you've chosen the hard way," he snarled, and his hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. "A pity." The world exploded. Rollins drew his pistol with practiced speed, but Silas was already moving. He threw himself sideways, back through the doorway of the house, grabbing the propped shotgun as he fell. The air beside his head sizzled as Rollins's first shot splintered the doorframe. Mercy had dropped to one knee behind a heavy rain barrel the moment Silas moved, her own pistol out and firing. Her shot went wide, but it made Rollins's men flinch, spoiling their aim. Gunshots erupted, a deafening cacophony that shattered the prairie silence. Wood splintered, dirt kicked up in angry spurts. Silas, on the floor inside the house, jacked a shell into the shotgun's chamber and fired through the open doorway. The blast was thunderous, a wide spray of buckshot that sent two of the deputies reeling back, their horses rearing in terror. One of them clutched a peppered shoulder, cursing. "Inside! Get inside!" Silas yelled to Mercy. She needed no encouragement. Keeping low, she fired two more shots to cover her retreat before scrambling through the doorway, bullets chewing at the ground where she had just been. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and for a moment, there was a lull, the ringing in their ears the only sound. "They'll try to flank us," Mercy said, breathing heavily as she reloaded her pistol, her movements quick and efficient. The windows. The barn, Silas countered, his mind racing, mapping out the geography of his home as a battlefield. They get to the barn, they'll have a clear line of fire into the back of the house. The ranch, once his sanctuary, was now a death trap. They were outnumbered, 5-2. Rollins's men were professionals, killers who followed his orders without question. A hail of bullets hammered the front of the house, punching through the thin wooden walls. Splinters flew through the air like shrapnel. "We can't stay here," Silas gritted out, crawling toward the back room. "We'll be pinned down, picked off." "What's the plan?" Mercy asked, crawling beside him, her rifle now in her hands. "The truth," Silas said, a grim idea forming. "You have the journal?" She tapped the leather satchel at her side. "Always." "Good. Keep it safe." He peered through a crack in the wall. Rollins was directing his men, sending 2 of them circling wide toward the barn. The other 2 were providing covering fire from behind the water trough. Rollins himself had taken cover behind the wagon that had brought this hell to their doorstep. A cruel irony. He was patient. He knew he had them trapped. Time was on his side. "We need to separate them," Silas whispered, his frontiersman's mind assessing the terrain. "Create chaos." He looked out the back window. The corral fence was sturdy, but it was just wood, and inside it were 3 powerful, intelligent animals who were growing more and more agitated by the gunfire, especially Zeke. The chestnut was pacing, his mismatched eyes wide with alarm, his head held high. "Mercy, cover the front. Don't let them advance. I have an idea." Without waiting for a reply, Silas moved to the back of the house. He took a deep breath, kicked open the back door, and sprinted for the cover of a small stone wellhead halfway to the corral. A bullet whizzed past his ear, fired from the deputies now nearing the barn. He dove behind the stones, the impact jarring his bones. He was exposed, but he had a clear view of the corral's gate bolt. It was a long shot. He raised his shotgun, took aim, and fired. The buckshot tore into the wood around the heavy bolt. It splintered but held. He cursed, reloading with shaking hands. The deputies at the barn now had a clear shot at him. Bullets chipped at the stone wellhead, showering him with fragments. He fired again. This time, the wood around the bolt latch shattered. The gate, under the pressure of Zeke pushing against it, swung open with a loud groan. For a moment, nothing happened. The horses stood in the opening, uncertain. Then a stray bullet from one of the deputies kicked up dust near Thunder's hooves. It was all the catalyst they needed. With a panicked snort, Thunder bolted. Bell followed an instant later, but Zeke did not run blindly. He charged. It was not a random stampede. In a pivotal moment of profound animal loyalty, Zeke did not flee from the fight. He charged toward it. He let out a piercing whinny, a sound of pure fury, and galloped straight for the 2 deputies who were taking aim at Silas from the side of the barn. They were not prepared for a 1,000-pound chestnut missile of rage. They yelled in alarm, turning to fire at the horse, but Zeke was too fast, too powerful. He slammed into one of the men, sending him flying like a rag doll. His horse reared and bolted. The other deputy tried to scramble away, but Zeke, in a terrifying display of controlled aggression, spun and kicked out with his powerful hind legs. The blow connected with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled to the ground and did not move. The tide had turned. The sudden, violent chaos of the horse's charge had shattered the deputy's organized assault. The 2 men at the water trough were now distracted, their attention torn between the house and the crazed horse that had just taken out their comrades. It was the opening Mercy needed. A rifle cracked from the front window of the house. One of the deputies at the trough cried out and clutched his leg, falling into the muddy water. The other, seeing his position was now untenable, broke cover and ran for his horse. Now it was just Rollins. He emerged from behind the wagon, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. His plan, his authority, his entire world was crumbling around him. He saw Silas break cover from the wellhead, running toward the barn for a better angle. Rollins raised his pistol and fired, the shot going wide. Rollins! The cry came from the porch of the house. Mercy stood there, exposed, the leather journal held high in her hand. Her pistol was holstered. She was not offering violence, but something far more devastating. "It's over, Tom!" she yelled, her voice carrying across the blood-soaked yard. "Jake Morrison's journal, he wrote it all down. The fires, the thefts. He wrote about Marcus." Rollins froze, his pistol aimed at Silas. His head snapped toward Mercy. His eyes widened in genuine shock and fear. The journal, the one thing he could not silence with a bullet. "He wrote about the night you killed him." Mercy's voice was relentless, a hammer of truth. "How you shot him in the chest and then lit the fire. Your last 2 men can hear me, Sheriff. The truth is out." The remaining conscious deputy, the one who had run for his horse, hesitated. He looked from his bleeding partner in the trough to the journal in Mercy's hand, then to the furious, cornered face of his boss. The foundation of his loyalty, built on fear and money, cracked. In that moment of hesitation, everything converged. Silas, reaching the cover of the barn, raised his shotgun. Mercy stood defiant on the porch, the journal her shield and her sword. Rollins, trapped between them, his power shattered by a dead man's words, made his choice. He spun, his face contorted in a final, desperate act of destruction, and fired at Mercy. But Zeke was there. The great horse, having neutralized the threat from the deputies, had circled back. As Rollins fired, Zeke charged again, this time from the side, a chestnut blur of instinct and loyalty. He didn't trample Rollins. He slammed his shoulder into him, a solid, unstoppable impact that knocked the sheriff off his feet and sent his pistol flying into the dust. Silas was on him in an instant, the butt of his shotgun crashing down on Rollins's wrist as he scrabbled for the lost gun. Rollins cried out in pain and fury, lashing out with his good hand. The 2 men fell to the ground, a desperate, grunting tangle of limbs. This wasn't a gunfight anymore. It was raw, personal. It was 15 years of suppressed rage unleashed. Silas's hands found Rollins's throat, his thumbs pressing down, seeing not the respected sheriff, but the murderer who had laughed while his brother's life bled out into the dirt. "This is for Marcus," Silas growled, his vision narrowing to the panicked, bulging eyes of the man beneath him. "Silas! Don't!" Mercy's voice cut through his red haze. He looked up. She was standing over him, her face pale but resolute. "He needs to face justice, the real kind. Don't become him." His grip faltered. He looked down at the gasping, terrified man whose life was in his hands. Killing him would be easy. It would be satisfying. But Mercy was right. Marcus had believed in the law, even if men like Rollins had perverted it. To murder him here, in the dust, would be to answer one crime with another. It would be vengeance, not justice. With a final ragged breath, Silas released his grip. He stood up shaking, every muscle screaming. Rollins lay on the ground, coughing and sputtering, his aura of power gone, leaving only a pathetic, defeated man. The last conscious deputy, seeing his leader utterly broken, dropped his gun belt and raised his hands in surrender. The fight was over. The silence that fell was profound. It was the silence of after a storm, a quiet filled with the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. The dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively. Zeke, his sides heaving, walked over and nudged Silas's hand, his mismatched eyes soft and questioning. Bell and Thunder, their panic subsided, drifted back from the edge of the property, drawn by the familiar presence of their protector. Silas looked at Mercy. Her face was streaked with grime, but her eyes were clear. In them he saw not triumph, but a deep, weary relief. They had done it. They had dragged a 15-year-old truth into the light. The cost had been high, written in the blood and splintered wood that littered the yard, but the debt was finally paid. Justice, real and hard-earned, had come to his lonely ranch on the prairie. In the quiet aftermath, the world slowly stitched itself back together. Mercy had used one of the deputy's horses to ride for the nearest town with a federal marshal's office, 50 miles east, taking the journal and the captured deputy as proof and prisoner. Silas, meanwhile, tended to the wounded, binding the deputy's leg and locking a conscious but broken Rollins in the barn's sturdy tack room. The second deputy Zeke had kicked was dead. The other had a shattered shoulder and a shattered will. There was no fight left in any of them. Their power had been a reflection of Rollins's, and his had been an illusion. When the marshals arrived 2 days later, they found a scene of grim order. They took Rollins and his men into custody, their faces a mixture of disbelief and professional gravity as Mercy laid out the contents of the journal. The story of Sheriff Tom Rollins, the respected lawman, unraveled with every word Jake Morrison had written. His empire of fear collapsed into a sordid tale of greed and murder. After they were gone, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. It was different from the silence of loneliness Silas had known for so long. This was a silence of completion, of peace. The air itself felt cleaner, as if a long festering poison had finally been purged from the land. He and Mercy buried the dead deputy in a simple grave on a far ridge, a somber task that spoke to the brutal cost of their victory. Then, they stood before the other grave, the one that had been the heart of the ranch's sorrow for 15 years. A simple wooden cross, weathered and gray, marked the spot. Marcus Ward, beloved brother. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. Zeke, Bell, and Thunder grazed peacefully in the corral nearby, their presence a quiet testament to the truth that was now, finally, laid to rest with the man they had loved. "He would have been proud of you, Mercy," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to suppress. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew." Mercy reached out and ran her fingers over the rough carved letters of Marcus's name. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "He was the hopeful one. I just held on to the anger. For a long time it was all I had." "Anger is a tool," Silas said, looking out at the vast, open land. "It gets the job done, but you can't build a life with it." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the shared grief a bond between them, no longer a source of pain but a foundation of understanding. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they were no longer haunting them. They were memories, integrated, honored. "What will you do now?" Silas asked, his gaze still on the horizon. The horizon no longer felt like a symbol of threat, but one of possibility. Mercy was quiet for a moment. "For 15 years I've been on the move, chasing shadows. I haven't had a home since this was supposed to be my home." She looked from the grave to the ranch house, to the horses, and then to Silas. "I don't know how to stop moving." "Maybe you don't have to," Silas said softly. He turned to face her, his weathered face earnest. "Maybe you're already where you need to be." The proposition hung in the air between them, fragile and new. It wasn't a declaration of love, not a promise of a future without scars. It was something quieter, more fundamental, an invitation to stop running, an offer to share the silence. Mercy looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the hardened frontiersman, but the man who had grieved beside her, fought beside her, and helped her find a justice she had almost given up on. She saw the splinters of wood still embedded in his knuckles, the dark bruises on his face, the weariness in his eyes that was now matched by a flicker of something new. A fragile hope. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was a hesitant, beautiful thing. "This place needs work," she said, her gaze sweeping over the bullet-scarred walls of the house and the broken corral gate. "A lot of work. I've got a strong back," Silas replied, a corresponding smile finally reaching his own eyes. "And I'm a patient man." It was enough. It was everything. They walked back toward the house as dusk settled, the sky a lyrical wash of violet and soft rose. The day's violence had given way to a profound tranquility. It was not the hollow peace of solitude, but a new kind of quiet, one filled with shared presence, a peace that had been earned, paid for in blood and sorrow and courage. Silas paused, one hand on the newel post of the porch, also scarred by a bullet. He looked out at the three horses, who raised their heads to watch them. Zeke, with his mismatched eyes, seemed to see right through him, a living symbol of a past that had been honored and a future that could now, finally, begin. Home, trust, love. They were not things that were given. They were things you built, one splinter and one scar at a time. And for the first time in 15 years, Silas Ward felt like he had the tools to start building again. He wasn't alone anymore. He was home.